In the early morning hours of June 22, 1941, the industrial geography of the Soviet Union suddenly became its greatest existential vulnerability. Operation Barbarossa, the massive German invasion, smashed into the western frontiers of the USSR, with three army groups aiming directly for its economic heart. The Soviet Union's industrial power was heavily concentrated in the west in Ukraine, Belarus, and the regions around Moscow and Leningrad. These areas contained the coal mines of the Donbass, the iron ore of Kryvyi Rog, and the heavy machinery plants that were essential for modern warfare. As the Wehrmacht blitzed forward, encircling entire armies and capturing vast swathes of territory at a terrifying pace, the Soviet leadership faced a catastrophic reality. If these factories fell into German hands, or were destroyed, the war would be lost before the first winter snow. The response was the Council for Evacuation, formed on June 24th, just 2 days after the invasion. This body was tasked with an undertaking of biblical proportions, to physically pick up the industrial base of a superpower and move it thousands of kilometers eastward, behind the protective barrier of the Ural Mountains. The scale of the evacuation was staggering, a logistical operation that rivaled the mobilization of the armies themselves in complexity and desperation. The order went out to scorch the earth for what could not be moved, but to save everything that could turn a lathe or press steel. In factories across Ukraine and western Russia, workers who were under constant aerial bombardment began the frantic work of unbolting heavy machinery from concrete floors. These were not small items. They were massive hydraulic presses, blast furnace components, turbine generators, and assembly lines weighing thousands of tons. The dismantling happened around the clock, often with the sounds of German artillery getting closer by the hour. There was no time for careful packaging, crating, or labeling. Machines were ripped from their foundations, numbered with grease pencils in a hurried scrawl, and dragged onto flatbed rail cars by exhausted crews. The chaos was managed by a ruthless, centralized bureaucracy that prioritized the evacuation of Group A industries, aviation, tanks, and munitions above all else, sacrificing consumer goods for the tools of war. The Soviet railway system, the NKPS, became the lifeline of the nation, stretched to its absolute breaking point by the dual demands of sending troops west and factories east. Between July and November 1941, the railways moved over 1,500 major industrial enterprises eastward, a feat considered impossible by foreign observers. This required a density of rail traffic that defied standard safety protocols. Trains were packed nose to tail, moving at a crawl, often targeted by the Luftwaffe, who sought to sever these arteries of survival. The rolling stock was a desperate mix of anything that had wheels: passenger cars, cattle wagons, open flatbeds, and hopper cars. On these trains rode the machinery, often exposed to the rain and snow, and the workers who operated them, along with their families. It was a journey into the unknown. For weeks, these echelons traveled towards the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. The conditions inside the cattle cars were horrific. Sanitation was non-existent, food was scarce, and the stifling summer heat turned the wagons into ovens, yet the discipline held because the alternative was extinction. When the trains finally arrived at their destinations, places like Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, and Sverdlovsk, the evacuees often found nothing but empty fields, frozen steppes, or dense forests. There were no factory buildings waiting for them, no housing, no electricity grids ready to plug into. This led to one of the most surreal and heroic chapters of the war, the greenfield production. The priority was so high that production often began before the walls of the new factories were even built. Workers would pour concrete foundations in the freezing mud, bolt the machines down, and start turning out artillery shells while snow fell directly onto the equipment. Canvas tarpaulins were strung up to protect the sensitive tooling, but the operators stood in the open air, warming their hands over bonfires fueled by scrap wood. The slogan was, "All for the front," and it was interpreted literally. The roof could wait, but the tank track links could not. It was industrialization at the speed of desperation. The city of Chelyabinsk became the symbol of this industrial resurrection, earning the legendary nickname Tankergrad. Here, the evacuated Kharkov locomotive factory was merged with the local tractor plant to create a behemoth of tank production that had no equal in the world. The population of the city exploded as tens of thousands of evacuees crammed into dugouts, basements, and earthen huts called zemlyankas. The overcrowding was severe, typhus was a constant threat, and rations were at starvation levels. Yet, out of this human misery rolled the T-34 tank. The engineers streamlined the design, reducing the number of parts and the finish quality to speed up mass production. They stopped painting the interiors and left the welds rough, focusing purely on combat effectiveness. Tankergrad became a relentless machine, churning out armor at a rate that the meticulously engineered German industry could not hope to match, proving that quantity has a quality all its own. The workforce that powered this industrial miracle was fundamentally transformed by the exigencies of total war. With millions of able-bodied men conscripted into the Red Army to plug the gaps at the front, the factories were manned by women, the elderly, and adolescents. In many plants, over 50 of the workforce was female. Women took on roles traditionally reserved for men, casting steel, welding tank hulls, and operating heavy drop forges. Children as young as 12 stood on wooden crates to reach the controls of the lathes, working 12-hour shifts alongside their mothers. The physical toll was immense. Sleep deprivation was chronic. Workers would often sleep on the factory floor, curled up next to their machines, to save the energy of walking back to their unheated barracks. The Soviet propaganda machines celebrated them as heroes, but the reality was a grim, relentless grind of survival, driven by a hatred of the invader and a desperate will to live. The winter of 1941-1942 tested this fragile logistical network to its absolute limit. As temperatures in the Urals dropped to -40 degrees, the environment turned hostile. The lubrication oil in the machines froze solid, the metal became brittle and snapped under stress, and the skin of the workers stuck to the cold steel, causing frostbite. To keep the factories running, large bonfires were lit inside the production halls, if walls had been built, or next to the machines outside. The railways, the arteries of this new industrial body, struggled against massive snowdrifts and fuel shortages. Coal had to be transported over vast distances, and power shortages were frequent. When the electricity failed, workers would manually crank the machinery if possible, or use the downtime to clear snow from the rail spurs. It was a battle against the elements as much as against the Germans. The fact that production actually increased during this winter is a testament to the sheer brute force of will applied by the Soviet people. One of the most critical, yet often overlooked aspects of the evacuation was the strategic relocation of the aluminum and aviation industries. Aluminum production requires massive amounts of electricity, meaning these plants had to be situated near hydroelectric sources. The evacuation of the Dnieper aluminum plant to the Urals and Siberia was a race against time before the massive dam at Zaporozhye was blown up by the NKVD to deny it to the Germans. This move saved the Soviet Air Force. Without aluminum, there would be no Sturmoviks, Il-2s, and no Yak fighters. The new aviation plants in Kuibyshev and Novosibirsk began producing aircraft in vast numbers. By 1942, the Soviet Union was outproducing Germany in aircraft, a feat that shocked Nazi intelligence, which had assumed the Soviet aviation industry had been destroyed in the initial invasion. The scorched earth policy that accompanied the evacuation was the dark, destructive twin of the rescue effort. What could not be moved was destroyed with ruthless efficiency. Coal mines in the Donbass were flooded, dams were dynamited, and agricultural stocks were burned in the fields. This denied the Germans the immediate economic spoils of their conquest, forcing them to bring their own supplies over extending, partisan-harassed supply lines. However, it also left the local population, who remained behind in a state of absolute destitution. The ruthless calculus of the Evacuation Council meant that resources were preserved for the state, not necessarily for the people living in the occupied zones. This strategic denial of assets bought the Red Army time, but the cost was paid by the civilians left in the charred ruins of the Western Soviet Union, who faced starvation and German reprisals without the industrial infrastructure to support life. By 1943, the strategic balance had shifted irrevocably due to this industrial maneuver. The German Wehrmacht was fighting at the end of a long, tenuous supply line, relying on factories in Germany that were increasingly being pounded by Allied strategic bombing. The Red Army, conversely, was being supplied by a secure, booming industrial base in the Urals that was completely untouchable by the Luftwaffe. The second front in the east was the factory floor. The output of the evacuated industries allowed the Soviets to conduct deep battle operations, creating the massive armored pincers at Stalingrad and Kursk. The sheer volume of material artillery shells, rockets, tanks, and trucks overwhelmed the technical superiority of German weapons. The German Tiger tank might have been a masterpiece of engineering, but it was overrun by swarms of T-34s produced in the rough-and-ready factories of the Urals. The evacuation also fundamentally altered the demographics and culture of the Soviet Union in ways that are still felt today. The Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia, previously peripheral regions, were suddenly urbanized and industrialized overnight. Universities, theaters, and symphonies were evacuated alongside the factories to preserve the nation's soul. The Leningrad Philharmonic Orchestra famously played Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in Novosibirsk, hundreds of miles from home. This cultural migration meant that the Deep Rear became a new center of Soviet civilization. Scientists and intellectuals lived in the same cramped barracks as the factory workers, creating a unique melting pot of Soviet society united by the war effort. This forced development laid the groundwork for the post-war industrial dominance of these regions, changing the economic map of Russia forever. As the Red Army began its march westward in 1944, pushing the Germans back towards Berlin, the evacuated factories did not move back. It was deemed too inefficient to dismantle them a second time. Instead, they remained in the east, continuing to feed the insatiable appetite of the offensive. The liberated territories in the west were ruins, scorched earth, twice over once by the retreating Soviets in 1941, and again by the retreating Germans in 1944. The reconstruction of the West would take decades, but the industrial power of the East remained the engine of the Soviet superpower. The Moscow to Berlin trajectory was paved with the steel forged in Magnitogorsk. The logistics of the advance were supported by the rail network that had saved the nation 3 years prior, now reversing the flow, sending trainloads of tanks west instead of refugees east. The story of the evacuation is filled with individual acts of improvisation that defy modern safety standards and engineering logic. In one famous instance, a steel rolling mill was too long to fit on standard rail cars. The workers simply cut holes in the walls of the drivers' cabins of the train engines and threaded the steel through the entire length of the train, creating a dangerous but functional transport. In another case, a chemical plant needed to restart production of explosives, but lacked a roof. They worked under camouflage nets to hide the flash of the chemical reactions from German reconnaissance planes. These stories illustrate a desperate creativity. It was a system that was incredibly wasteful of human life and comfort, yet incredibly efficient at the one metric that mattered: survival of the state. The perception of the Soviet war effort in the West often focuses on the brutal battles Stalingrad, Berlin, Kursk, and the vital aid of Lend-Lease. However, the logistical feat of 1941 was the foundation of all those victories. Military historians argue that the war was effectively won or lost in the autumn of 1941, not just on the battlefield, but on the railway tracks. While Lend-Lease trucks and radios were crucial, the vast majority of the tanks, artillery, and small arms used by the Red Army were Soviet-made, produced in these evacuated factories. The Soviet Union saved itself through its own agonizing exertion, lifting its own weight and carrying it across a continent while bleeding from 1,000 wounds. It was a triumph of domestic production under the most impossible circumstances imaginable. The legacy of this evacuation is visible today in the industrial skylines of cities like Yekaterinburg, Omsk, and Chelyabinsk. These cities grew from provincial outposts into major metropolises because of the decisions made in panic in 1941. The Rust Belt of Russia is actually the hero belt of the evacuation. For the people who lived through it, the memories were of cold, hunger, and the ceaseless noise of machinery. They remembered the soup made of boiled leather belts and the sawdust bread. But they also remembered the pride of seeing the train cars loaded with finished tanks heading west, knowing that their suffering was being transmuted into victory on the front lines. The psychological impact of this collective effort forged a national identity of resilience. Life in the evacuation zones was a constant negotiation with starvation. The card system for bread was the only currency that mattered. Workers in hot shops, foundries, and forges received slightly higher rations, perhaps 800 grams of bread a day, while dependents received much less, often near starvation levels. To supplement this, victory gardens were planted on every available scrap of land around the new factories. Potatoes became the difference between life and death. The state organized collecting expeditions where children were sent into the forests to gather mushrooms, berries, and pine needles to make vitamin C infusions against scurvy. This foraging was not a hobby, it was a state-mandated survival strategy to prevent mass malnutrition among the workforce. The role of the Gulag system in the evacuation cannot be ignored, though it is often scrubbed from the heroic narrative. While the skilled workers were evacuees, much of the brute labor required to build the new railways and dig the foundations for the factories in the frozen earth was performed by forced laborers from the NKVD camps. These prisoners worked in appalling conditions, with mortality rates far higher than the civilian evacuees. Their invisible labor provided the infrastructure upon which the miracle of evacuation was built. It adds a layer of grim reality to the achievement the Soviet Union used every tool at its disposal, including its own enslaved population, to defeat the existential threat of Nazism. Communication between the dispersed factories and the central planning in Moscow, and later Kuibyshev, was a chaotic web of telegrams, courier flights, and erratic phone lines. The centralization of the Soviet economy, often criticized for its inefficiency in peacetime, actually allowed for rapid decision-making during the crisis. There were no endless committees or shareholder meetings. If the State Defense Committee ordered a factory to switch from making tractors to making tank treads, it happened immediately. Directors of factories who failed to meet quotas faced the terrifying prospect of the NKVD. This atmosphere of fear, combined with genuine patriotism, drove productivity to inhuman levels, removing all bureaucratic friction. The return of the Soviet government to Moscow after the panic of late 1941 signaled the stabilization of the front, but the industrial heart remained in the Urals. The center of gravity of the USSR had shifted permanently eastward. This geographical shift had long-term geopolitical consequences that lasted well into the Cold War. It made the Soviet Union a truly Eurasian power, with a massive industrial base located deep in its interior, safe from European invaders. This strategic depth would become a cornerstone of Cold War planning, where the atomic citadels of the Soviet Union were built in these same remote industrial cities that had been born in the fires of World War II. Ultimately, the Soviet industrial evacuation was a victory of logistics over kinetics. The Germans planned for a short, sharp war of maneuver and conquest. They did not plan for a war of industrial attrition against a nation that could pick up its economy and move it out of reach. It demonstrated the resilience of a planned economy under total war conditions. While the market economies of the West took time to convert to war production, the Soviet command economy could order the instant dislocation of millions. It was a human tragedy of displacement, but a strategic triumph of relocation. The German juggernaut was defeated not just by the Russian winter or the Russian soldier, but by the Russian railway gauge and the Russian factory worker who refused to stop working even when the roof was missing.